to welcome you to our program tonight, Byzantium, Rome's Lost Empire, with our speaker, Mr. Lars Brownworth. Thank you all for coming out on this rather inclement evening, and we appreciate your perseverance in getting here tonight. Before we begin, if you haven't already done so, please silence all cell phones or anything electronic. We'll all appreciate that very much. You probably noticed that Mr. Brownworth's book, Lost to the West, The Forgotten Byzantine Empire That Rescued Western Civilization, is available just outside the auditorium, and he'll be happy to sign copies for you immediately after the program. Lars Brownworth is in the early stages of a productive and distinguished career. He received his bachelor's degree from Houghton College in Ancient and Medieval History, minoring in philosophy and science. For 8 years, he taught at the Stony Brook School and traveled extensively during the summer to Italy, Turkey, and other places. And Lars, with the encouragement and help from his brother, ultimately created a podcast, 12 Byzantine Rulers. This has become one of the phenomena of the podcasting world, ranking in the top 5 educational podcasts on iTunes and in the top 50 of all podcasts. But thankfully, books still exist, and we're happy to have his first book with us tonight. So please welcome Lars Brownworth.
Well, I'd like to say thank you to the Smithsonian Institution for having this, and especially thank you to all of you for coming. I was trying to figure out what to say today, how to start off, and I was staring at this picture here to try to give myself some motivation. It's a picture of Romulus Augustulus, that's one of his coins. He's the last Western Roman emperor. And that's a man who lived about 1,000 years later, Constantine XI, who's the last Eastern Roman emperor. And as I was thinking of what to say, I realized I can't talk about the Byzantines tonight. I'm sorry. I don't want to disappoint. Please don't leave. But I really can't, because there's no such thing as a Byzantine Empire. Nor is there such thing really as a Byzantine. They called themselves Roman. They were the eastern half of the Roman Empire. So it's logical for them to refer to themselves as Roman. And they got the name Byzantine as an insult by people who wanted to specifically say that they were not Roman. In the 18th century, Westerners started writing things like the following quotes. Montesquieu said, "Byzantine history is nothing but a dull mix of rebellions, sedition, and treachery." Doesn't sound too dull. Napoleon wrote, he warned his soldiers, hey, don't be a joke to posterity like the Byzantines. Edward Gibbon, in his magisterial Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, wrote, you know, it's hard to find people throughout Byzantine history that deserve to be rescued from oblivion. And my personal favorite, Voltaire, wrote, Byzantine history is an embarrassment to the human mind. You know, a name is an important thing. If you think back to the biblical story of the Garden of Eden, the first thing Adam does when God shows him around the garden and says, this is yours, is he names everything around him. There's something powerful about it, something of ownership and identity in a name. And what I want to know, and it's always a tragedy when you get your name from someone else and you can't name yourself. And what I want to know is, how does the East and West get so far apart that this man is a Roman and this one isn't, when they both have a direct line of emperors dating back to Augustus Caesar? And the answer to that question, really the disregard of the East and the West, the gap between the East and the West, starts with a bath. oddly enough, in the year 668 with the Emperor Constantine II. That's him on the left with the impressive beard. He was 11 years old when he became emperor, and I think the beard is an attempt to add a little gravitas to say he really knew what he was doing. He was in charge of the situation. But he was the last emperor. I start with him because he was the last emperor to preside over a unified culture. We tend to think of, with good reason, of the Mediterranean basin as not one culture, but fragmented. Here's the empire of Constantine II that he inherited. There was no significant difference, culturally speaking, between the lands, say, of Italy and the lands of North Africa, Egypt, Asia Minor, southern tip of Spain. There were differences, there were regional differences. But they were largely the same culture, north, south, east, and west. That culture was the language of the empire. The entire empire officially was Latin, as it always had been, but everyone spoke Greek, at least in the west. This is an inscription in the Celsus Library in Ephesus, western Turkey. You can see there's the Latin inscription and the Greek inscription for everyone to read. It's officially a Christian empire, but that does not by any means entail everyone's a Christian in the empire. In fact, paganism was alive and well. As late as the 10th century, you can always tell what's going on by what laws are passed. If they're passing a law against something, it's probably going on. And in the 10th century, a Byzantine emperor had to pass a law saying you couldn't use bears to foretell the future. But the Olympic Games, celebrating the pagan gods, were only stopped in 393. And pagan gods popped up in motifs, even in Christian circles. It was just part of your culture. This, for example, is a scene from a place in Italy. This is the baptism of Christ. He's there in the middle, standing in the Jordan River. There's the Holy Spirit descending as a dove. There's John the Baptist earning his nickname. And over here, you have a rather bemused-looking river god. Sort of disconcerting. The empire also was a place of startling social mobility. We tend to think of empires as being hierarchical and restrictive, but the Eastern Roman Empire wasn't, at least not as much as we think. It was mostly composed of peasants. Here's a scene of tax time. This man is paying his taxes here. These are paying their taxes. This guy has to make sure he has his scales, make sure you're not shaving any of your coins. And there's the tax collector. The bulk of the population of the empire were peasants, but you didn't necessarily have to stay that way. Also, interestingly enough, farming tended to be communal. I would share my pigs, you would share your goats, and this guy would share his grain. And if you couldn't meet your taxes, if you couldn't pay your taxes, there was a certain law again in the 10th century where your neighbors, your wealthy neighbors, had to pay your taxes for you. That would be nice. There were more than one emperor that started out life as a peasant and became an emperor. There was one who started out life as a wrestler and became an emperor, and that held true for women as well. There was one empress in particular, Theodora, who started life as something like a prostitute. Her father was a bear keeper, and she ended up becoming empress and running the empire. One way to get higher socially was to join the army, because after 20 years you get your land, your proverbial mule and 20 acres, and you go and retire somewhere and start farming. If you make enough money, you can buy your way to the Senate and then start a political career. It was also a very highly educated place. This is a Byzantine university, and at certain periods in the empire they had something approaching 100% literacy. And that included women. There were three parts of the Byzantine educational system. First is primary education. Everyone got that. That's reading, writing, a little homework thrown in. Secondary education is between the ages of 10 and 16, mostly boys. And then the university is available in the big cities. You can never tell who your classmates were as well. For example, St. Basil of Caesarea, who's one of the Eastern fathers of the Orthodox Church. He's also the Greek Santa Claus. His head is preserved in a monastery in Mount Athos. He was classmates with Julian the Apostate, who was a Byzantine Roman emperor who tried to re-paganize the empire. I imagine there were some very interesting conversations while they were supposedly listening to the instructor. It didn't matter where you came from. You could be from Africa, you could be from Asia Minor, you could be from Greece. Where you were from was no bar to social advancement. The cities were a nice place to be, especially because there were excellent hospitals. If you got sick, you could go to a hospital. Here's a picture of one. They had separate wings for diseases, separate disease. They had doctors who specialized, and some of the doctors were women. If you were a woman in Byzantium, I'm not sure there's any place you would want to go. Let me just start with this. As a woman, if you could go back in time, there'd be no place you could go where you were treated fairly and similar, equal to a man. But at least in the Byzantine Empire, you could become a doctor, you could become a merchant, you could stay at home and raise the kids. There were options for you. But in hospitals, what we have here on the right is the first ever surgical manuscript. It dates from roughly 900. So it was a pretty advanced place. But wherever you traveled in the empire, if you walked from what is modern Morocco, all the way through North Africa, up Asia Minor, and into Eastern Europe, you would come across familiar things. All the cities would be laid out the same way. You'd see familiar arches, you'd see familiar structures. And there was a unity to the Mediterranean world that there really isn't now. This is a picture of an aqueduct. It happens to be in Africa. This delivered water to the city of Carthage. This aqueduct is in Palestine, delivered water to the city of Caesarea. And this aqueduct supplied the imperial city of Constantinople. Most citizens of the empire would be familiar with the Colosseum, the Flavian Colosseum, but it was by no means the only one. You could go to Tunisia, for example, and be in this one, which is slightly smaller. You could wander on over to Libya, which at the hometown of the only Libyan emperor of the Roman Empire, Septimius Severus. This one's slightly smaller. Or even in Croatia, you could visit this Colosseum, this amphitheater. What really destroyed this unity, what really destroyed this world, was the coming of Islam. And that happened essentially during the reign of the Emperor Constans II, our man right there on the left with the impressive beard. Constans II, however, was a strong emperor. And this is the last chance the Roman Empire has of preserving that common culture around the Mediterranean. Constans II decided to raise a large army. He needed money for that, so he started taxing, very heavy taxes. He took a trip to Rome, the first emperor to do so in several centuries. And while he was in Rome, he didn't win any friends because he was only there to collect money. And since there wasn't a lot of money in Rome, that meant going around to the various monuments and stripping them of whatever precious metals they had. He even had workmen crawl around on the top of the Pantheon and strip the lead so it could be melted down for the army. In 668, he finally had his army, but he also had a lot of unhappy citizens who were annoyed. They didn't want a single more tax. And so one of them, a chamberlain, snuck into his bath, and as the emperor was reposing, he smashed a soap dish over his head and killed him. That is really the last time the Romans were capable of checking, if they ever were, of checking the spread of Islam. And very quickly, the empire collapsed. Most of the imperial territories collapsed. What wasn't conquered was just thrown away. Alexandria, which is the main city in Egypt, surrendered voluntarily. Sicily, the governor of Sicily, murdered his wife and then abducted a nun. And to escape imperial justice, he figured, let's invite the emir from over here into, actually around here, into Sicily. And he did so. The emir came with his army, killed the governor, and then took over Sicily, although it did take about 100 years. The governor of Septim, this little town right here, which was guarding the entrance into Spain, he had a daughter who was having an affair with the Visigoth king of Spain, and he was annoyed at this, so he decided, let's just let the Arabs in, let them cross. By the way, the Arabs were led by a man named Tariq, and he landed in the shade of a giant rock, which still bears his name, Gibraltar, the rock of Tariq. But very quickly, the empire loses, you can see, more than half of its territory. And this is a shocking thing, it's a traumatic thing for the empire. People keep looking to Constantinople for help, for a counter-offensive, and nothing ever happens. And the reason for that, one way to explain the astonishing collapse of the empire, is that emperors in Constantinople are completely and utterly concentrated on Constantinople. And some of them don't even care what's happening around them. They become very myopic. The best example of this I can think of is an emperor in the year 820. His name was Leo V. And Leo V had a buddy by the name of Michael. He couldn't speak very well. His nickname is Michael the Stammerer. But the two of them were close friends. They murdered the emperor, and Leo was crowned emperor. His friend Michael was a big talker, and he kept saying things like, you know what, I should be emperor. And I think I'll kill Leo. He's not showing me the respect he needs. Word eventually reached Leo that his friend Michael was saying these things, so he told him to tone it down, but they were friends, so he said, just stop saying things like that. Michael, of course, was unable to stop doing things like that. That's the kind of man he was. And eventually he was, on Christmas Eve of 820, he was dragged in front of Leo V. And Leo's asked him point blank, did you say that you were going to plot to kill me? And to his great surprise, instead of denying it, Michael said, yeah. Not a good strategy for a long life. And Leo flew into a rage, and he said, immediately, you're going to be executed. But you know what? Normal execution is too good for you. You should be tied to an ape and thrown into the furnace. An ape? Really? Were apes that common? You could just, the emperor wants an ape, then go run and get an ape, number one. Number two, isn't really that a waste of a good ape? What's really happening here, this is a throwback to ancient Rome, and I'm talking about Republican Rome, ancient Roman days. The ancient Romans, if you were guilty of parricide or fratricide, you were sentenced to death by being sewn into a sack. First you'd get beaten so that you were bleeding, and then you'd get sewn inside a sack with a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. And then you were thrown into the river Tiber. And the reason why they did this was because you're supposed to be humiliated with these shrieking animals. Death, it's too good for you. You need to be humiliated as well. Well, so poor Michael is dragged away, but before he's executed, and thankfully for the ape, the wife of Leo says, Leo, you don't want to do this. It's Christmas Eve. The holiest day in the Christian year is Christmas. You'll be receiving the sacrament. You cannot receive the sacrament with the blood of this man on your hands. Just execute him after Christmas. Leo said, all right, sent him down to prison. He was shackled, so he couldn't get out. But Leo just couldn't get it out of his mind. So in the middle of the night, he snuck down. And he looked, and what did he see? The jailer was asleep, and Michael was asleep. And this enraged Leo, because he figured Michael should be up, being repentant, he should be crying, he shouldn't just be sleeping like he has a clear conscience. So he vows, he said, I'll not only kill you, I'll kill the jailer as well, who's fallen asleep. And then he leaves. Now, unbeknownst to him, there was a little boy hiding underneath the cot where Michael was sleeping. I don't know what these prisons are. Apparently you could just go in. But the boy had seen just the feet. He'd never really seen the emperor, but he knew it was the emperor because the emperor was wearing purple boots. And the only person who could wear purple boots was the emperor. There's actually a case of a rebel who was taken to the emperor's presence. He was surrendered. And the emperor said, he was wearing his purple boots, and the emperor said, I will not even look at you until you take off those boots. So they took it very seriously. So the little boy woke up the jailer, and he woke up Michael and said, guys, this is what happened. And the jailer realized, I'm in the same boat as my prisoner now, so I might as well throw in my lot with him and help him escape. So he got word to Michael's followers and said, listen, you have to act quickly or else it's going to be too late. So Michael's followers put on their swords, got dressed in monks' robes, and snuck into the Imperial palace at daybreak. This is like the equivalent of party crashing at the White House. They sneak in there. No one notices it's early in the morning. Everyone's dressed the same. They're tired. The Emperor Leo loved to sing. He was well known for it. Especially, he didn't have a really great voice, but he loved to sing. And at one point in the liturgy, in the very beginning, he loved to just belt it out. And everyone knew this. So they said, that's the signal. When he starts belting it out, then we know who to kill, we attack. So early morning comes, it's Christmas morning, the service begins, Leo starts bellowing, and the conspirators immediately block the doors, rip off their disguises, take out their swords, and they start attacking the emperor. The only problem was, it's dark, it's smoky, they're a little tired, they attack the wrong man. They attacked the officiating priest, who, as you might expect, was singing. Now, Leo had a big, thick head of hair, and the priest who was being attacked knew this. He happened to be bald, good thing for him. So he whips off he had a cowl, and he whips off the hat and says, look, I'm not the emperor, I'm bald, stop stabbing me. They do, but in the meantime, Leo, at this point, has grabbed a huge cross from the altar, and he's grabbed an incense burner, and he's swinging them around, yelling out for his guards, who can't get there because the doors are being blockaded. One account says he defended himself for over an hour, which I find hard to believe. But eventually his arm gets chopped off, he gets killed. The one thing he didn't tell them was he had the key to Michael's chains hidden on him. They killed him, they didn't suspect this. They went down and they knew they had to move quickly, because if they don't crown Michael emperor right away, someone else will become emperor, and then Michael's still in the dungeon. So they grab Michael, they can't find the key, because it's on Leo's corpse. They don't know this, so they grab Michael, hustle him upstairs, and in what is surely the most undignified coronation in Byzantine history, they crowned him with the chains of his incarceration still on his feet. Now, emperors like these, they're not really concerned with what's going on in the outside world. They are concerned with power at home and maintaining that power. So they're not very responsive as the empire sort of crumbles away. But eventually the bleeding stops. But the Eastern Roman Empire has to reevaluate itself because this is traumatic. You believe that you are the empire of God. This is the first empire that embraced Christianity. And to be defeated at the hands of what you consider is a false prophet is deeply emotionally scarring. And so the Byzantines have to recalibrate their strategies. And this drives the first real wedge between the East and the West. Because they come to the conclusion that they can no longer, their army is well trained. There's a picture of them riding around some poor Bulgarians. Their army is very well trained, but it's not worth the risk of losing it. They're highly trained, expensively armed, and if you go and waste them, just throw them somewhere, it's not worth the risk. So the Byzantines developed a defensive strategy where if you have to have a war, get in and get out as quickly as possible. Number two, always evaluate very carefully what you're fighting for. Because if you're fighting in some podunk town, that really means nothing. Just for pride's sake, or because it was invaded. Is that really worth the risk, the army? Most of the time they would say no. And the most important thing for the Byzantines was diplomacy. There's an old saw that goes something like, when the guns speak, the diplomats fall silent. Byzantines would have thought the reverse. There's no time more important to employ diplomacy than in the middle of a battle. Because today's enemies might be tomorrow's allies. The goal of fighting is not to destroy your enemy, it's merely to weaken him enough so that he'll stop fighting. And diplomacy, the way you employ diplomacy is one of the most successful ways, is bribery. They figured out bribery was very easy. People loved gold, and they were always willing to invent very creative ways to stop fighting. Another advantage of bribery and diplomacy is that you can subtly reinforce certain messages. This is a crown that was given to the King of Hungary by Byzantine Emperor Michael VII. It's hard to see, but there are three images. This is the Byzantine Emperor, this is his son, and that's the King of Hungary. If we zoom in on these three, you see Byzantine Emperor in full regalia, his son dressed virtually identically, and then the King of Hungary. This is how they're placed in the crown. And then you'll notice a certain number of things. First of all, Byzantine Emperor has a halo, so does his son, but the King of Hungary does not. And that's very much on purpose, because there is only one emperor. And this is the main point of Byzantine ideology. There is only one emperor. There are many kings, but there is only one emperor. Jesus said in the Bible, they're a very Christian society, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And St. Paul had said, honor the emperor. These weren't just words to the Byzantines. These weren't some random Bible passage. This was a command. They had Caesar in front of them. They saw Caesar every day. They gave up political control of the entire Mediterranean, but they never gave up the idea that every Christian owes allegiance to the emperor. He's something special. He's God's divine representative on earth. You should hear in there an echo of what the Western Church is saying, specifically the Pope. And this is a huge problem, because the Pope and the Emperor are essentially claiming to be the same thing. And that's going to lead to many problems. What it does initially lead to is a Cold War in the Balkans. The Balkans are largely unchristianized at this point. The Slavic peoples have come down into the Balkans, and there's a race who can convert them first, Constantinople or Rome. Everyone's still pretending that Christianity is just one, but there's a Cold War going on. Neither side will admit it. Constantinople does something very clever. They send these two brothers. This is Saint Cyril, and there's Saint Methodius, his brother. And they discover that the Slavs have no written language. So they make one up based on Greek. This is an example of it. But that's where the Cyrillic alphabet comes from. Here's Saint Cyril holding the Cyrillic alphabet. And this allows people to maintain their own traditions, their own language, and be part of the Orthodox world. The Pope would prefer that everyone use Latin, and that unfortunately costs him in Eastern Europe. Eventually, the Church of Rome and the Church of Constantinople get so hostile to each other that they officially excommunicate each other. And that's a break in Christendom. It happens in 1054. And the Christian church breaks up into Orthodox and Catholic halves. And this is very important because it now means that Westerners think Easterners are heretics and will be less likely to help them. And you can see this most clearly during the Crusades. There are a number of problems during the Crusades, misunderstandings during the Crusades. For one thing, the Crusaders have this idea that they're fighting a holy war, and the Byzantines have no concept of a holy war. It's a foreign idea to them, and they're very suspicious of these crusaders. Secondly, the Byzantines think Constantinople is the center of the world, literally. Whereas in the West, they believe that Jerusalem is the center of the world. And this leads to further complications during the Crusades. When the Crusaders initially show up in Constantinople, the main problem is the Byzantines are afraid of them. And so they only allow them in just a few at a time into Constantinople to see the sights. And when the Crusaders come into Constantinople, everything around them is foreign. They see these, they go to Christian churches where they cross themselves the wrong way. They take communion in these Christian churches, and the bread's all wrong. It has yeast in it. In the Western church, they use unleavened bread. And they don't understand that the Byzantines, which are dependent on diplomacy to survive, don't just shut out the Turks, the Muslims, and say they're our enemy, it's war to the death. Now, the Byzantines need to survive. They need to keep on good terms with the Muslims around them, because they really don't think the crusade is going to be successful. So what they do, the Byzantine emperor alerts the Turks to the coming of the Crusades. This is a classic Byzantine strategy. It's, they're just trying to survive. They're using the diplomatic card. The Westerners see this as treachery. Whose side are you on? You're telling our Muslim enemies that we're coming. You're telling them our route. Secondly, when you capture Muslim prisoners, the Byzantines would give them meals without pork. They would treat them like royalty. They would give them a choice. You can either serve in the legions with us, or you can have a safe passage home. And this also seemed a little bit treacherous. Just what side are you on? And so eventually the Crusaders come to the realization, or they come to the conclusion, that we're better off conquering Constantinople than we are just letting them be. Because, remember your Homer. He said, beware of Greeks bearing gifts. The Greeks are duplicitous, they're not to be trusted. And you know what, they need to pay their fair share. Byzantine emperors were always saying we're poor. Everyone knew that wasn't true. And there's an idea that the Byzantines really needed to pay their share. Well, in 1204, the unthinkable happened. A crusading army besieged Constantinople. This is a French representation of it by an eyewitness. And they sacked the city of Constantinople, looted it, and destroyed most of it. Thoroughly looted it. And in the process, they really drove the final wedge between East and West. Because now, neither the Orthodox or the Catholics considered each other to be Christian at all. And there was a saying in Constantinople after the Fourth Crusade: better the Sultan's turban than the Pope's mitre. And what they meant by that is the walls were closing in. The Turkish Muslim power was closing in, surrounding Constantinople. They knew it was only a matter of time until they took the city. And the only hope of salvation was to appeal to the Pope, appeal to the West for help. And the people of Constantinople thought to themselves, we would rather be conquered than to suffer the indignity of humiliating ourselves by asking for help from the West. And they meant that. Unfortunately, this mistrust of East and West does not end with the fall of Constantinople. They lasted a little over 200 years beyond 1204, but the sacking of Constantinople really did break their power. The Byzantines themselves maintained, or the Venetians rather maintained, that 1/4 of the wealth of the world was located inside that city when they conquered it. That's an overstatement, but most of the loot was melted down. Some of it was carted off to different cities. These are the famous quadriga, the 4 horses, which used to stand above the Hippodrome in Constantinople, and now reside in the Cathedral of St. Mark's in Venice. There are replicas now on the outside, but you can still go see these in the top, in the upstairs of the church, as well as the loot that they brought back from the 4th Crusade. They last a little over 200 years. In 1453, the final blow falls. The last emperor, Constantine XI, makes an appeal to the west. No one comes. He's outnumbered something like 60,000 to 7,000. And it's a foregone conclusion. The Turks overrun Constantinople. Not quite the end of the story, because though Constantine XI had no children, he did have a niece named Sophia. And Sophia, before the fall of Constantinople, was married off to Ivan III, who was the Grand Duke of Moscow. Ivan III would eventually be called Ivan the Great, the founder, really, of the Russian Imperial dynasty. And his wife, Sophia, brought with her to Moscow this throne. And if you look carefully on this throne, on the top here, you have a double eagle. And there's another right here. That is the symbol of the Byzantine Empire. There is actually a lot of thought onto what exactly this signifies. Some people think it's from having the Roman Empire had 2 capitals. It was divided into both east and west. Whatever the truth, that had a deep effect, because not only did this throne come, but all the ceremonies, the regalia of the Byzantine Empire was transferred to Ivan III. And he considered Moscow to be the 3rd Rome. First Rome is Rome. The second Rome, New Rome, is Constantinople. And Moscow is the 3rd Rome. And what he's saying is the Orthodox tradition, the Orthodox Empire, has transferred from Rome to Constantinople to Moscow. And the Russians will identify with the Byzantine Empire, and this will actually last beyond the communist takeover in the 20th century. Stalin actually encouraged Byzantine studies, which is a strange thing if you think about it. Because communism is by definition anti-religion. And it's very hard to separate religion, orthodoxy in particular, from the Byzantine Empire. But what's happening here is the Russians so identify with the Byzantines, their orthodox cultural past, that it survived even the spread of communism. And Stalin was taking a specific lesson from this. In 1991, the Russian people voted to design a new flag, and that flag, they voted to bring back the Byzantine Imperial eagle on their flag. This is a people where the legacy of Byzantium still thrives. In 2008, the Russian State Department released a video called The Lessons of Byzantium. And in it, they go over the history of the Byzantine Empire. And they specifically say, Byzantium was great when they cared only about Byzantium. And they fell when they listened to the West. They fell when they opened up to the West. All their problems started because they trusted the West. But the West is by nature, and they spent a long time on the 4th Crusade. The West is by nature duplicitous and untrustworthy. The message obviously was clear to Putin and Medvedev that if Russia wants to be great, it must close down. If Russia wants to be great, be like the Byzantines. Don't listen to the West. Go your own way. Greatness lies in identifying with our Easternness our orthodoxy, and our Byzantine affiliations. Even after 500 years of being gone, the Byzantine Empire still casts a long shadow, and we would do well to learn more. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions.
Could you speak a little bit about the art and architecture of the Byzantines?
Sure, the art and architecture of the Byzantines. This is also very influential in the West, far beyond the borders of the Byzantine Empire. The earliest example is Justinian's Hagia Sophia, which is a revolutionary building. It becomes the model for all Greek churches after that. Byzantine artisans were sent all over the world. The Dome of the Rock, for example, was built using Byzantine craftsmen. You can see the Byzantine motif of the Hagia Sophia reflected in many mosques today. As far as their art is concerned, originally it's identical to Roman art because it is Roman. But the Byzantines go through a period called iconoclasm. This was also a result of the horrendous losses to the Arab armies. They came to the conclusion that the reason why they were losing is because they were worshiping images. They were spending too much time and effort on icons. And Muslims, with their strict prohibition, cannot portray God because that's idolatry. They were successful, and obviously the reason why they were successful is because they were not worshiping idols. So, for roughly 200 years, the Byzantines turned on their art and destroyed most of it. And sculpture seems to have been a casualty of this. You never really recover sculpture in the Byzantine Empire, all those Roman traditions. Art after the iconoclastic controversy. Leo V, who I talked about, is one of the last iconoclastic emperors. They focus much more on icons, becomes much more stylized, less realism afterwards. So, as far as the impact of Byzantine art, after the iconoclastic controversy, it sort of goes in its own direction. And before then, it's sort of hard to separate from Rome. Yes?
This is just a statement. Actually, the major holiday, religious holiday in the Catholic Church is Easter.
Easter, right. Thank you. Yeah, the major holiday is Easter. Leo's wife objected to him. I should have said it is a major holiday. But even if it was just a normal Sunday, I think she would have objected. You can't take the sacrament and have her. But thank you for doing that. Yes.
Yes. Can you elaborate the reason, details of the spark, the schism in 1054, and who was the Pope, and who was the Emperor at that time, and make some difference about ceremonies and rituals of both churches? There was something more than
Right.
conversion
Right.
of the Balkans. I think that there was something about Trinity,
Right.
right or wrong. Can you correct me?
The question is what exactly split the church? The East and the West were going different directions relatively early on. But the official split, they excommunicated each other as early as the 6th century. But the official split came in 1054, and it was over creed. The creed is a statement of belief that all Christians share. It defines what makes a Christian. And the Spanish church in the 7th century had added several words to it. And the Greek church in Constantinople said, you can't add something. It's called the filioque. Means endless Son. God the Father, the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, is what they were arguing over. But the Greek church said, you can't just arbitrarily add words. You have to have a council. The whole church has to decide this. You don't get to just decide. The Pope's position was, since the Pope was, everyone acknowledged that the Pope is the most august bishop of the church. The Pope said, well, I get to decide. I should be the final arbiter of it. I don't need a council. You know, Christ said that, you know, on this rock, St. Peter, the first Pope, you know, I will found my church, and therefore I should be the final arbiter. That was the cause, the official cause for the break. There were lots of little differences. Greek priests tended to tonsure their heads differently. They were also allowed to marry. In the West, they weren't. For communion, the Greek church used bread with yeast in it because it was symbolizing the risen Christ, whereas the Western church was holding more to the tradition of the ancient Israelites with unleavened bread. They crossed themselves in different ways. They held their hands in different ways when they crossed themselves. Little things like this. But the big thing really was the filioque. Does the Pope have the right to say, no, this is how it's going to be, or do we need to decide things in councils?
When you say the filioque, it's, in other words, Jesus was not the Son of, was not God, and that the mystery of the Trinity. In other words,
right.
It was the manhood. It was the man and not God. In other words, there was a discussion of it.
Right. There was a heresy called Arianism, which taught that Jesus was a created being. He's more than man, but he's less than God. And so the Spanish church wanted to say, no, Jesus is the equal of God. And to do that, they added the words that the Holy Spirit doesn't just proceed from God the Father, but he also proceeds from God the Son. He also proceeds from Jesus because they're equal. The Eastern Church agreed with this. There wasn't too much here to divide them. But nevertheless, yes.
One brief point: the Eastern Church would have no problem with proceeds from the Father through the Son, but not and the Son.
Right.
My question is, how much of the Byzantine legacy was continued through the Ottoman Empire?
Well, that's an excellent question. How much of the Byzantine legacy was carried on through the Ottoman Empire? The Ottoman Sultan saw himself as the successor of the Byzantine emperors. He even styled himself as Caesar. And the name Constantinople doesn't get changed. It's the capital of the Ottoman Empire. It doesn't get changed into the 20th century. But the Ottomans also came in, obviously, with their own traditions, their own faith. I guess I'd answer that question by saying they tried to consciously style themselves, their imperial forms. If you look at the Blue Mosque, it's quite obviously patterned on Hagia Sophia. So it's sort of not a direct continuation, but a distant continuation. Yes, sir.
When the two churches split, the Pope, of course, was the head in the Western Church, but in the Eastern Church, how did the hierarchy, how did it work? I know nowadays there's various heads of different, with it. I think the chief one in Constantinople.
Right. How was the hierarchy, the church hierarchy, split up? The patriarchs in the East. Officially, the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, since it was the holy city, that was outside. They were all technically equal. There was a special reverence for the Patriarch of Jerusalem because he was outside. But the most powerful patriarch in practice was in Constantinople because he was right next to the emperor. He had access to imperial power. Officially, they were all first among equals. Oh, sorry, they were all equals.
How many were there?
There were originally 5 patriarchs of the Christian church. Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, and Alexandria. And of those 5, one is in the west, it's Rome, and the other 4 are in the east, which I think is a contributing factor to why the Pope develops into sort of an authoritarian hierarchical structure, whereas the east, there are 4 equals there, and they retain this idea of you have to decide things in concert. Yes?
In Rome, they had Roman law, which was uniform throughout their empire. Did the Byzantine Empire use Roman law, or did they have their own laws?
Yes, great question. Did the Byzantines use Roman law? 5th century, or 6th century emperor rather, Justinian the Great, is the one who codified Roman law. It was a mess, all different redundant things. It wasn't written down in one place. So Justinian codified Roman law, put it in one easy manual to understand. And successive, as the years went on, that sort of got out of date. Successive Byzantine emperors would recodify it, add new things to it. So they used Roman law. But it did, there are some interesting ways they adapted it. Divorce, for example. It was very hard to get a divorce. You could get 1, maybe 2, forget about a 3rd. There's one case where a man and woman hated each other, and they were married, it was an arranged marriage, and they wanted to get divorced. So the Emperor Leo decided a good solution would be to lock them inside a house. And when after a week of this, nothing had advanced, he allowed a divorce on the grounds of mutual hatred. But generally, the way Roman law gets adapted is through a Christian.
What's the source of the concept of Byzantine bureaucracy? Is it these complex laws and
Yeah, what's the definition or the origin? The negative term. It comes from the Crusades, because the Crusaders tended to be let's show me what to smash and hit, and we're going to win this, we're going to crush through. With the Byzantines, we're in a much weaker position, so they have to depend on diplomacy, a little more subtlety. They also had a court ceremonial that was, by this time, well over 1,000 years old. And if you wanted to go see the emperor, you could just walk in. You had to bow to this guy, pay off this guy, go see this one. When you finally got to the emperor, you couldn't look at him, you had to bow down. You had all this strict protocols. And the Crusaders had this impression, this is all just a waste of time. And so they would use the term Byzantine as sort of a negative thing. Yeah, it's just unnecessarily complex. As well as the sinister, because the Crusaders always believed that the Byzantines were going to stab them in the back. And that also retains, where Byzantine still retains that. Yes?
The day Constantinople fell, that was early in the morning, the Turks entered the city. I read that the Byzantine emperor took off his emperor clothes and went to the streets like a soldier fighting the Turks, and his body was never found. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. The Ottomans desperately wanted to find him. But he did, when he saw that the city was lost, the Ottomans were pouring through, he threw off his imperial regalia, disappeared. The Byzantines, the Ottomans rather, after the battle was over, they needed to find him so that they could prove that he was dead so resistance wouldn't continue. So they went through, they washed the dead bodies, and they found one with boots on that had eagles on them. So they figured, all right, this is the body. And they cut off the head and displayed it to everyone. It failed to impress anyone who had known Constantine XI. So the Ottomans eventually admitted that, okay, we didn't really get out. So his body never was found, but a number of legends did spring up afterwards. One in particular is that he's gone, his body's never found because he didn't die. An angel came down, turned him into marble, and he's buried below the Golden Gate, and one day, when the Greeks again control the city, he's going to come back and lead them to the restitution of the Byzantine Empire. Sort of like a King Arthur, the once and future king. The interesting thing is, apparently, the Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, believed it because he had the Golden Gate bricked up. The emperor couldn't enter the city.
It's still closed.
Still, right. There's a small. Yes.
Were the inhabitants in Constantinople predominantly ethnically Greek? And how long did Latin continue to be used as an official language?
That's a good question. Latin as a official language was used up through the 7th century. The Emperor Lars finally said, all right, enough is enough. Because you had to publish everything twice, and it wasn't cheap to do that. And he was tired. If he wanted military efficiency, he was tired. And so in the 7th century, Greek becomes the official language. But the Byzantine Empire was always ethnically diverse. When the Crusaders do show up, 1000 AD, they complain that in the streets there's the babble of a dozen languages. People sort of look different. Greek was always the dominant language, but never the only language. There's Arabic, Armenian, dozens of Eastern languages. Yes.
So, as the empire declined, and shrank, where did the money come from to maintain the roads and the imperial jurisdiction and all that stuff?
Well, the answer, unfortunately, where the money came from usually was taxes. And you could sort of judge good emperors or successful emperors and unsuccessful emperors by how efficiently they could collect taxes. But where the gold came from is actually a little bit of a mystery, because there are certain periods in Byzantine history where it should be poor. They're losing on all fronts. They're paying tributes like it's going out of style. And at the same time, they're making golden lions. They're making thrones out of golden that can raise and lower. And they're spending gobs of money, scattering money around. And the best guess that I've heard is that they periodically would discover new gold mines and then introduce money in. But as far as taxes, they would levy a 10% tax on everything that came in or out of Constantinople. And Constantinople is on the western terminus of the Silk Road. So a lot of you could get furs and amber and wood from the Black Sea region down. You get things in from the Mediterranean. It's a wonderful place to have a mercantile center. So that seems to be how they got most of their money. Yes?
The Greek Orthodox, as I understand it, still look to Constantinople as their see. Can you tell us a little bit about that history?
Post-conquest history of the Orthodox Church? Yeah, I was in
even
Greece.
through to today.
Okay. Yeah, I was in Greece the other day, and just as a little aside, they still call it Constantinople. But the Orthodox Church was allowed. This is part of the Sultan wanted to be seen as a new emperor in the Byzantine tradition, so he appointed a patriarch. The center of the patriarchate was the Hagia Sophia. This is the central church of Eastern Christendom. That was converted into a mosque immediately. So the patriarchate had to move to another church. He chose one called Palm Christos. It's still there, but after a few years he moved out of that and went to his present location, which is the Phonar district. There was a thriving Greek and Orthodox population of Constantinople up until the 20th century, when there was a large population exchange between Turkey and Greece. And unfortunately, the result of that was Istanbul became a 99% Turkish city, and I think it lost some of that vibrancy. But the story of the Greek Orthodox Church in Constantinople is a sad one, and it's one of a slow death by strangulation. Last time I was there, I visited the one church, the one Byzantine church, which was built in the 1200s and is still a Christian church. And they had a grenade lobbed over the wall. If the church needs repair, you have to apply for a permit, and it's almost impossible to get. It's not illegal to be a Christian, but you're certainly a second-class citizen. And that, with the population exchange, has resulted in very few Greeks or Orthodox actually living in Constantinople. But it's still the seat of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, obviously, and Orthodox Christians still look to it as their Jerusalem, their Rome.
So the Turks are trying to squeeze it.
Yeah, I don't want to be too hard on the Turks. They have their own traditions and their own religion, but yeah, I would say it's probably a fair assessment. I think Turkey is moving in that direction. They're moving toward fundamentalism, I would say, unfortunately. Yes?
I noticed the flag is displayed, presumably a Constantinopolitan flag of some sort. There's the colors of the present Russian flag. Any connection?
Right, that actually is the one version of the current Russian flag. I had it up there because the Russian people in 1991 voted to bring back the Imperial eagle as part of their flag, so it's on the soccer uniforms and everything. But this is a version of the current Russian flag. Yes?
What was the status of the Jews in the last few centuries of Constantinople, and did things get better or worse under the Ottoman Empire?
What was the status of the Jews? Not great anywhere, unfortunately, in either the East or the West. They were tolerated. There were periodic episodes of persecution. Toward the end of Byzantine history, you sort of have this desire for purity, this desire to sort of become more orthodox, and it's becoming less diverse. Under the Ottomans, initially, I think the Jews are treated much better, but that eventually breaks down toward the end of the Ottoman Empire. I unfortunately don't have too many specific examples, but my feeling certainly is that as the power declined of either empire, things got worse for non-minorities. From non-minorities. Yes.
I thought that after the Ottomans took over in 1423, during the Inquisition in 1492, the Sultan welcomed the Jews, and there was one of the oldest synagogues in the world is in Constantinople.
You're right. Thank you. That's a great example. After the city fell, they did welcome them when they had to leave Spain. Yes.
First off, one of the things that was interesting is I remember we learned about the Russians, and they viewed themselves as the protectors. They wanted to view themselves as protectors, as Christians in Turkey and in Constantinople. But the question I have is, who first called them Byzantines? I know that's from an ancient city name.
Right.
But who was the first to call that empire Byzantine? I don't know.
It's in the 16th century rather. There's a German by the name of Harmonius Wolff, and the point he was trying to make is that the Holy Roman Empire is the real Roman Empire, and so he didn't want to say the Constantinopolitan Empire because that's way too long. So he used the earlier name of Byzantium. So it doesn't appear till then, but the Edward Gibbon really sort of sets the modern reputation, or up until recent years. Yes?
Could you talk a little about the conservation and dissemination of classical learning through Byzantium?
Sure. One of the greatest gifts the Byzantines gave us was a passing on of our legacy. I think 40,000 of the 50,000 ancient Greek texts come to us through Byzantine pens. The Greek cultural heritage was so vitally important. The Byzantines, even where it conflicted with Christianity, they chose not to get rid of it because it was just too much a part of their heritage. There is the equivalent of a Byzantine Dark Age, when money's running scarce. It's in the middle of the sort of Islamic invasions. But even then, there's personal libraries. The University of Constantinople has, or the Library of Constantinople has over 100,000 manuscripts. And many of these survived the Fourth Crusade. And it's when the city was eventually conquered by the Turks in 1453, they took those manuscripts, and shortly before 1453, they took those manuscripts to the West, which helped to inspire the Renaissance. So I would say the role Byzantium played in preserving our knowledge of Greek. We would know nothing about Homer, Aristotle, Plato, but for the Yes.
In the Eastern Church, was there any organized cleansing similar to the Inquisition?
I'm sorry, was there any
organized cleansing like the Inquisition?
Was there any organized cleansing like the Inquisition in the Eastern Church? Not that I'm aware of, but I'm by no means an expert on those kinds of things. For all there may have, but I don't think there was. But I might be wrong. Yes, Lou.
In terms of technology, I remember reading somewhere many years ago that the emperor had a throne that could thrust him like 20 feet into the air very rapidly to intimidate barbarians and so forth. I guess it's also pretty hard on the emperor when he got old. But how were they in terms of technological development and over time, or were they fairly stagnant?
Up to a point, they seemed to be pretty innovative. The big example, I guess, would be Greek fire, which we still don't know exactly how it was made, but it was this napalm-like substance that could burn. They did advance their fields, as you said, the throne, the emperor would go up, change clothes, come down. They had organs, they had a water clock, they had fountains that could be powered throughout the city. They had a type of air conditioning. You had to be an emperor, sorry, to in the throne room they had these two golden lions which would get out and roar. They had organs through them after that, and they had songbirds which would sing on command. So they were pretty ingenious. You get to a certain point where you just, I think, start stagnating, and that unfortunately did happen to the Byzantines. I think around the time the Battle of Manzikert, which I didn't talk about, but in 1071 they lost a massive battle, which is why they appealed to the West for help, which started the Crusade. But at that point they lose most of their empire, and it's just sort of a slow retreat from there. Yes.
Where does Trebizond fit in?
Trebizond, very interesting. After the Fourth Crusade, the empire officially really is conquered because the capital city is gone. But there are these splinter empires that survive. One's in Epirus, another one's in Nicaea, and the third is in Trebizond. And that actually outlasts the empire because the Byzantine world never again becomes unified. They retake Constantinople from the Crusaders, but they never reconquer everything. And 1453, Constantinople falls, but Trebizond is actually the Byzantine capital until I think 1461. So it lasts a good deal of time. They derive their lineage of their emperors from a man named Andronicus the Terrible, who was a very colorful character, just before the Fourth Crusade. Yes?
You mentioned the patriarch in Moscow continuation. Didn't that grow out of Rus and Kiev?
Didn't that grow out of?
Kiev.
Yes. I think the origin of it, though, is the Prince of Kiev was the first to become baptized as a Christian, and he definitely did pull the Russians into the Byzantine orbit. That's absolutely true. But as far as an official seeing Moscow as a third Rome and adopting some of the Byzantine coronation rituals, that's from Grand Duke Ivan III.
Okay, I want to thank Lars very much for a cogent overview of this fascinating topic.